turn it over to Alison. I know a lot of us are really excited to hear what she has to say and teach us.
Thank you, Kathy. And that was a very kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me here tonight, and thank you everyone for coming. I see some familiar faces or names in the Zoom screen. So I'm going to be talking tonight about discovering and dealing with unconsciousism. And just a little housekeeping before we start, in case you're like me and you join meetings just a couple minutes late and tend to miss this stuff, just please keep your mute on and your video off to help with bandwidth. You can adjust your view if you want to. So if you look in the top right-hand corner of your screen, you may see a little button that says View. And if you click on View, an option that you will see on some computers at least is side-by-side speaker. And that can sometimes be the best view of both the slides and the speaker. If you don't see that, then just play around with things in a way that works for you. You're going to want something to write with. So if you want to grab a notebook or a pad of paper or your phone notepad or whatever you write with, that will be useful to have on hand. And there will be time at the end for questions if you want to take those. You can type those in the chat box at the end or as you have them, and Bruce is going to be moderating tonight and reading those questions from the chat. And Kathy, just a reminder to mute yourself. So let's start by defining what it is we're going to be talking about so that we're all on the same page. So what is racism? Racism can be defined as a system of advantage that's based on race. And this is a common definition in a lot of work on racism, but here I'm drawing most directly on work by Stephen Roberts at Stanford and Michael Rizzo at NYU. But this isn't how most Americans think about racism. So most Americans think about racism as being limited to individual actions that are obviously and intentionally biased. So if an employer tells an employee that they were fired because of their race, then we would say that's racism, clearly. The problem with this very narrow definition, though, is that it misses most of that occurs in our society. And that allows racism to persist and to flourish, invisible to those of us who benefit from it. In reality, racism is much more complex. It's this complex set of biased laws, biased policies, and biased institutions that shape and are shaped by individuals' thoughts and feelings and actions. Because of this, you can have unbiased actions that still perpetuate racism. And that's one thing that we'll talk more about in a little bit. So today we're talking about unconscious racism, way that racism can be unconscious. When we define racism as individual and intentional action, we help hide the rest of it from conscious attention. Now, there are a lot of ways in which racism can be unconscious, and really this topic could be a year-long course, so we're going to get one little hour of that year-long course today. We're going to focus for today on anti-Black racism perpetuated by non-Black people. There are, of course, many other forms of racism, but this is where we're going to start. I'm also going to be focusing in this talk on the experience of people with racial privilege, and especially white people. Partly that's because I'm white, and so that's what I can do, right? I can talk about racism from the perspective of a white person. And partly because it's not on Black people to fix anti-Black racism, it's on the rest of us. All right, so I want to talk today about two major ways in which racism can be unconscious for people with racial privilege. We are often unaware of, first, racism in our history and our racial privilege. So these are the two things we're going to be talking about in more depth today. We'll spend about the first 2/3 of our time on the first one, part one, racism in our history and our systems, and then we'll talk about the shorter part, time-wise, racial privilege in part two. And as we talk, Kathy mentioned, you may notice that you feel uncomfortable. And just remember that's okay. Racism isn't comfortable. It should not be comfortable. Or you're helpless. Like, what can I do about this? So I'm going to reassure you now that I'll be giving you some concrete ideas for addressing racism that meet you where you are, wherever that is, whether you're just getting started here or whether you've been thinking about these issues for some time. And just one more reminder, and turn off your video to help with bandwidth and so that everybody can hear. All right, so let's start with part 1 of 2, which is looking at racism in our history and in our systems. So research suggests that on average, relative to Black Americans, white Americans lack critical knowledge about the history of race and racism in the United States. So if you're like me, then your history classes in school didn't cover the crucial information covered in books like Ibram Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning, or Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law, the New York Times' 1619 Project. And the problem is that without this knowledge, we can't see that racism is already in motion in our history and our systems. We learned a little bit more about this history in webinar 1 last week, which talked about the history of housing discrimination in Sacramento and in Curtis Park in particular. And of course, this local history is a microcosm of how federal and local housing policy segregated America and helped white people build wealth while preventing Black people and other people of color from doing so. So let's spend just a few minutes right now brushing up on that history. I'm going to show you a very brief 3-minute quick overview of how redlining worked in the United States.
Eugene Burnett came home with almost 1 million other Black GIs. They had fought for the country in segregated ranks. They returned hoping for equality and the American dream. For many, that dream was a new home for little money down and some of the easiest credit terms in history.
I went up to the salesman. We're interested in your home. We're interested in buying one. And what is the procedure? Is there an application to be filled out? So forth. So he looked at me, looked around, and he said to me, he says, listen, it's not me, but the owners of this development have not as yet decided to sell these homes to Negroes.
It was as though it wasn't real. You can't imagine. But for someone to come out and actually tell you that they can't sell to you. You know, I was really on an up. Man, look at this house. Can you imagine having this? And then for them to tell me because of the color of my skin, I can't be a part of it.
The FHA underwriters warned that the presence of even 1 or 2 non-white families could undermine real estate values in the new suburbs. These government guidelines were widely adopted by private industry. Race had long played a role in local real estate practices. Starting in the 1930s, government officials institutionalized the national appraisal system, where race was as much a factor in real estate assessment as the condition of the property. Using this scheme, federal investigators evaluated 239 cities across the country for financial risk.
So that those communities that were all white, suburban, and far away from minority areas, they received the highest rating, and that was the color green. Those communities that were all minority or in the process of changing, they got the lowest rating, and the color red. They were redlined. As a consequence, most of the mortgages went to suburbanizing America, and it suburbanized it racially.
The racial logic adopts the principle that an integrated neighborhood is a bad risk, is a financial risk, that an integrated neighborhood is likely to be an unstable neighborhood, unstable socially, but therefore also unstable economically.
When the white residents of 8 Mile Road in Detroit were told they were too close to a black neighborhood to qualify for a positive FHA rating, they built this 6-foot wall between themselves and their black neighbors. Once the wall went up, mortgages on the white properties were approved. Between 1934 and 1962, the federal government underwrote $120 billion in new housing. Less than 2% went to non-whites.
I can understand an individual, depending on his environment or his family or whatever, being racist, but for your country to sanction it, give him tools to do that, there's something deadly wrong there.
All right, so this history is important. Without it, we can't see that racism is already in motion. Beverly Tim, who is the author of the book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, has likened racism to a moving walkway, like or a people mover that you see in an airport. And she points out that if the system is set up to move in a racist direction, then if you're neutral, if you are standing still, you're still moving with it in that racist direction. You have to actively walk or run in the opposite direction if you want to move against it. So the point is that when we're being totally neutral or passive or colorblind in our own thoughts and feelings and behaviors, the racism in the system gets perpetuated. Some concrete examples of how unbiased actions can perpetuate racism that's already in motion because of our history include racism in higher education. So colorblind admissions policies tend to maintain higher education. We saw this with Prop 209, the affirmative action ban in California, which a recent UC Berkeley study suggests harmed Black and Hispanic students, increasing their number in the University of California system, while reducing their odds of finishing college, going to graduate school, and earning a high salary. At the same time, the policy didn't appear to greatly benefit the white and Asian American students who took their place. Just a note that Prop 16 is on the November ballot to repeal Prop 209. So Prop 16 would be an example of walking in the opposite direction on the moving walkway. Another example of racism that's already in motion is racism in our neighborhoods, right? It's not enough to just be unbiased in who we sell our house to, right? That's not going to desegregate our neighborhoods. They've been segregated by federal and local policy that gets perpetuated over time by policy and decisions that people make. And if I just go about my business, the segregation persists. I would have to actively do something different. Go out and invite public housing into my own neighborhood, something like this, to be moving in the opposite direction on the walkway. Okay, so we've seen how the racism in our history means that even unbiased, so-called colorblind actionism. It's also important to recognize that this history creates bias in our thoughts and feelings and behaviors. So our actions are not always unbiased because the bias in the system leaks into the bias in our own minds. So again, focusing on housing discrimination as one particularly central example, the history that we just reviewed helped to create segregated neighborhoods and a giant racial wealth gap, right? The wealth of a typical white household in the US is over 11 times as large as the wealth of a typical Black household. And the gap between the average wealth of a white family and a Black family is about the same as it was in 1968. Come very far. In fact, on that metric, we haven't come anywhere. So what happens next? Well, what happens next is that we observe a world around us where white people tend to live in wealthier neighborhoods and Black people tend to live in poorer neighborhoods. And if we don't learn about and consistently think about the history that explains this pattern, We come up with our own explanations, drawing on societal narratives like hard work leads to success. So a lack of success must mean, and then we fill in the blanks. And then we develop over time automatic associations between certain groups and certain traits that shape how we think and what we do. So for example, we might start to automatically associate white people with being hardworking and smart, and Black people with the opposite traits. And that's following like down this waterfall, right? From the housing discrimination policy that led to segregated neighborhoods and this racial wealth gap. And then we start generating some mental machinery to explain it. So these automatic associations that we learn from looking at the world around us can then influence our behavior in biased ways. And I'll show you some examples of that now. So in one experiment that looked at this sort of thing, participants were asked to look over a set of job materials and make a recommendation about whether the candidate should get the job or not. And the researchers randomly assigned participants to see one of 3 sets of materials. In one condition, participants saw a job candidate that seemed to have strong qualifications. They were clearly qualified for the job. In a second condition, the candidate seemed to be marginally qualified. Their materials suggested that maybe they had the qualifications necessary to do the job, but maybe not. It was ambiguous. And in a third condition, the applicant had weak qualifications. They were clearly unqualified for the job. The researchers also varied whether, again randomly, whether participants saw an applicant who appeared to be Black or who appeared to be white. So participants are evaluating a Black or white job candidate who is either has strong qualifications, marginal qualifications, or weak qualifications. And here we can look first at what happened when the job candidate had strong qualifications. See here is that these bars are basically the same. They're not statistically different from each other. There was no bias when participants were evaluating the strongly qualified candidate. That is, a similar percentage, basically almost did that the very qualified white candidate and the very qualified Black candidate should be hired at about the same rate. What happened when the qualifications were weak, when the candidate was clearly unqualified for the job? There's no bias. Again, these bars are statistically the same. So regardless of whether the candidate was white on the left or Black on the right, virtually no participants recommended them for the job. So those are the 2 clear-cut conditions. The condition that's not clear-cut is in the middle. When the candidate was marginally qualified for the job, it wasn't quite clear whether they had the right qualifications, good qualifications or not. That's where bias emerged. The participants recommended hiring the white candidate compared to hiring the Black candidate. And again, the materials were identical except for the apparent race of the applicant here. So the point is that when you're not sure, in this case, in this marginal qualification condition, this ambiguous situation, there's room for these automatic associations in our heads to shape our decisions. Another example of how automatic associations play out is in the assumptions that jump to mind when we see someone. So for example, if you were to look out your window right now and see somebody standing by your car, your mind might jump to a different is, say, a white woman compared to if it is, say, a Black man. In this video, we're going to see another example of a similar bias.
Today we're going to figure out the difference between how people react when he tries to break into a car versus when I try to break into a car. Let's find out. Nobody cares. I've been here for 30 minutes and there was a cop here at one point and he didn't even try to stop me. Let's just see what happens when Quentin gives it a try.
point is when things are somewhat subjective and ambiguous, like a marginally qualified job candidate, or somebody's breaking into a car and it could be their own car or it could be somebody else's. That's when these biases can creep in. They happen across all these different decisions we make, like who to hire and when to call the cops. And they also happen in a way that perpetuates and exacerbates the systemic inequities that give rise to them in the first place. So for example, here's an example of a biased decision that feeds
Alison,
right back in.
Alison,
Yes.
I hate to interrupt, but we have lost your slideshow. We're just.
Oh, it's coming back, never fear. It'll come back in just a moment. It's just a blank slide.
Oh, sorry.
No worries. Now that I think about it, it's very ambiguous. So I'm going to show you. In fact, I will bring it up just to calm Mary Ellen that she has not lost visual. Here's an example of a biased decision that feeds right back into the housing discrimination and racial wealth gaps that we were discussing. This New York Times article already about an interracial couple trying to sell their house in a predominantly white neighborhood. And they asked an appraiser to come and appraise the house, and the appraiser did, and the appraisal came in for $330,000. And then Ms. Horton, who is a lawyer, she's the Black woman pictured on the in this photograph on the left. Not everything was going according to plan here, and so she wondered what would happen if she went through the house and removed all photographs of Black people. So all photographs of her, any books by Black authors. She took her biracial kid to Target and left her white partner at home while a second appraiser came. And the second appraisal came in for $465,000. So $135,000 more than the first appraisal when the house looked white compared to when the house had pictures of Black people in it. So the point here is that individual bias and systemic bias are intimately connected and they keep feeding into each other. So what do we do about it? I'm going to give you now some concrete ideas for addressing systemic racism. And I've divided these into a beginner slide, an intermediate slide, and an advanced slide. I don't know if those are the right labels, but the point is that you can figure out where you want to start and go from there. So I'd like you to get out your notebook or pad of paper now and start writing some I will kinds of plans. First on the agenda is self-education. We're not directly harmed by systemic racism. We have to learn to see it. We haven't been doing it our whole lives, and we have to take a crash course and catch up. So there are some great reading suggestions at the Sierra 2 website that Kathy mentioned earlier. And actually there are going to be a lot of links on this slide. So I'm going to ask Kathy now, if you can, to just copy over the text that I sent her earlier and paste it into the chat. And that way, for anyone who wants to copy over these links more easily, it should be easier to copy them over from the chat. So reading up is a good first start here. A second really straightforward thing to start doing now is to directly address the wealth gap. And you can do this even if you are not yourself super wealthy. So you can just start by spending your dollar intentionally. This was an idea that was brought up too at the webinar last week from somebody in the audience. You can shop owned businesses, you can order from Black owned restaurants. The first link here is a link to the Sacramento Black Chamber of Commerce. And you can browse by category. So if you want photography or bakery, you can browse by category and it will give you a list of Black owned businesses. And the second link is a list of Black owned restaurants you can order from. The idea in this vein is to understand the case for national reparations. You may decide ultimately that you agree or disagree with a specific stance, but understand why a reasonable person would make the case. Understand the history and understand the logic behind making a case for national reparations. And then you can also do something that's sometimes called personal reparations, but it just means putting some of your money toward supporting Black folks. Again, you don't have to have a lot of money to do this. The simplest way to do it is to pick an organization and set up an automatic monthly donation. So here are 3 examples of organizations run by Black people and for Black people. They're not like the 3 best ones. They are just 3 that that you could, they're starting points, or you could do your own research if you prefer. But National Bailout and the Okra Project and Color of Change are all good organizations to consider in this theme. So think about which of these, if you feel like this is your level, this is your speed, you want to start here, which of these do you want to start doing right now? And look at some of these things. Or tomorrow, first thing, when are you going to, which one of these are you going to start with, and when are you going to do it? Make a plan, write it down. So those are kind of simple first steps if you're just starting out. If you feel like, yeah, I got that, what's next? This next part is for you. So I'm going to walk you through what it might look like to make an action plan. And I'll walk you through the steps. You don't have to do this on the spot right now, but you could take a picture of this slide, for example, and work through it on your own later. So step 1 might be to think about and write about. It's really helpful to actually write down answers to these questions in addition to thinking about them. So think about and write about, where do you have influence or input? What roles and networks do you have or hold access to? These could be personal networks or professional networks, both. Are you on the PTA? Do you write for the neighborhood newspaper? Do you have a decision-making role in your workplace? Are you part of a gardening group or a running team? Whatever it is, we all have different networks of people, different places where we hold some power, some decision-making power, or we at least have input into decisions that are made. So make yourself aware of where those are for you. I know that when I did this, I was doing it a few months ago, and I was surprised by sort of how many ways that I'm connected to other people and how many decisions I actually have either invited input to or could have input to if I tried to voice a strong opinion about something. The next thing to think about is what anti-racism goals you want to take action on. What do you care about? Maybe it's housing last week, maybe it's schools, maybe it's healthcare, maybe it's climate change, all good issues to care about. Then think about and do some research on who is doing racial justice work in this area already, or how will you find out? Google is your friend here for many of these things. You can learn a lot just by searching online. And the point here is that people, and especially people of color, have been actively working on racial justice in all of these areas for a long time. So find them and follow their lead and learn from the work they've already done. There is no need to reinvent the wheel here. So many times I have thought in the past, and I've heard other people say, well, I don't even know where to begin. But we don't have to begin. It's already started. We just need to find the people who have thought through and how to do this work, who have experience doing it, who have plans, and support them and provide help for the work that's already going on. A next question to ask yourself and write about is, what self-education do you need to do? And what's one concrete first step? So what don't you know much about, and where will you look for that information? And then I'd suggest thinking about how you will lead works that you identified earlier, and how you will bring people along with you. How will you reach into those networks and build and organize consensus and collaboration around the work that you want to do? And finally, it's important to think through how you will hold yourself accountable, both for listening to people of color and for moving in an anti-racist direction. So how will you practice listening and learning from other people whose experiences are different from your own? And how will you catch yourself? You get distracted and you're on the people mover, so you accidentally start moving with the racist system. So useful ideas in this space can be creating an accountability group or an affinity group with other people who are, who have similar experiences to you and are working on some of the same stuff. You might meet weekly or bi-weekly or monthly to check in about progress towards your goals, troubleshoot problems that have come up, catch yourself when you've done something that didn't actually turn out to be the best idea, and figure out how to move backwards and try a different tack, etc. Another really useful technique here is to set concrete goals with timelines that you put in your calendar. So I am going to do this week, next month, by the end of the year, and I'm going to write it down in my calendar that I will have done it by this time. So that if you don't do it, you can sort of catch yourself, and because writing that down makes it so much more likely that you'll do it, right? All right, so if you'd like to take a picture of this slide, you could just snap a picture, or of course this will be recorded and you can access the recording later on if you want to come back to this at some point in the future. Finally, if you're, or when you are ready for it, here's one more step to go. And these steps go on and on. This isn't the end, right? And these aren't the only steps I could have picked. There's some of them. Got to start somewhere. And so a next step that you could take at this point would be to audit yourself or your organization, to take seriously the point that your calendar and your budget reflect your priorities, and then to audit yourself and or an organization that you're part of or a group that you're part of to see if your priorities are what you think they are or if you'd like to change them. So you can calculate just very straightforwardly, what percentage of your time are you devoting to anti-racist work relative to other things? And does that match your values? If you rank ordered the things you were spending most time on, less time on, and the least time on, is that you would assign them in terms of what you think is most important to least important. And then the same thing with a budget. What percentage of your own personal budget or your organization's budget are you devoting to anti-racism work relative to other things? And does that match your values? I think this exercise can be really clarifying for figuring out, not just with anti-racism work, kind of with most things in life, are we spending our time and our money on the things that we actually think are the most important to do? All right, so far, we've been focusing on understanding and addressing racism in our history and our systems. And now we're going to talk about another part of racism that is often unconscious, and that is racial privilege. So remember that we said that racism is a system of advantage that's based on race. But when we talk about racism, and especially when white people talk about racism, we tend to leave those advantaged by racism out of the conversation and therefore out of our conscious attention. And you can see this, to me, very clearly in the way we often talk about racism when we're talking. So, for example, historian Barbara Fields and sociologist Karen Fields talk about a concept they call racecraft, which they describe as a conjurer's trick of transforming racism into race, leaving Black persons in view while removing white persons from the stage. The broader point here is that we often omit white people when talk about racism and when we think about it. So I'm just going to show you some common sentences you might encounter. And I just want us to think about, where are the white people in these sentences? So you might hear, Black people were systematically excluded from these neighborhoods. You might hear, Black people couldn't get loans. You might hear, in the wake of George Floyd's death. You might hear, Latinos were segregated into urban barrios in poor neighborhoods. And I just think it's important to ask. I say sentences like this all the time, automatically. But it's so important to start asking ourselves, why are there no white people in these sentences? There could be. We could be talking about white people in each of these sentences. Where did they go? The problem is that when our language, and therefore our thinking, focuses only on disadvantage, we can't the whole picture. This is a system, and we are all in it. This system not only disadvantages some, it advantages others. Now, you may not like that it does this. You may look at this picture and think, oh, why does it have to be a seesaw or a fixed pie? One goes up and the other goes down. It doesn't. It does not have to be like this, but this is what we have. And if we want to change it, we first have to see it. And if you're advantaged by the existing system, it can be much, much harder to see. So some of you may have read Peggy McIntosh's piece on white privilege, unpacking the invisible knapsack, or listened to her TED Talk. If you haven't and you want to better understand white privilege, it's a really helpful place to start. I especially like her TED Talk on it. But she talks in both places about how white privilege is often invisible to white people. And she tries to help white people begin attending to the various advantages they may get in society just by virtue of being considered white. You can think about there are other dimensions of oppression as well, right? Men have gender privilege, straight people have sexual orientation privilege, people with lighter skin tone have skin tone privilege. So it's a concept that broadly applies to sort of any hierarchy in society. And when we ignore our own privilege and advantage along any of these dimensions, it's more comfortable. So as a white person, I don't want to think about how I am benefiting daily from racism. That's really uncomfortable to think about. But we have to look at this whole picture if we want to change it, because we need to be conscious of how we fit into it, right? This isn't some amorphous run by weather patterns. This is a system that we participate in. We vote, we elect our local leaders, we make rules, we decide where to spend our money, where to send our kids to school, when to raise a ruckus about a new gas station or a new homeless shelter. But notice how uncomfortable it is to make this conscious, to see ourselves in the system when we're on the advanced things. I know that for me, when I really look straight at this stuff, I feel this sinking sensation in my stomach, and my breathing gets kind of shallow. Maybe you're feeling some of the same things. It's not comfortable, but it's necessary to sit with this discomfort, to see how we fit into the system if we want to change it. Let's talk about one more place where we get tripped up when we have privilege, which is in how we respond when we make a mistake. Now, we all know what it's like when somebody that we know or don't know, when somebody does something that makes us know exactly the response we want in that moment. So I'll use an example that I'm familiar. I'm sitting in a meeting and I make a point and the leader running the meeting ignores it, even when I say it again. And then all of a sudden the meeting leader pays attention. Now, if I were to say in that moment, hey, I made that point already several times. Why didn't you listen when I said it? What I want to hear in that moment is so simple. It's just, I'm sorry, I'm going to work on that. Do you want to say anything else? It's so straightforward what I want to hear. So we know exactly what we want when we're on that side of the interaction. And you know what else we know that seems easy is there are some situations where we are totally comfortable with the idea that if we hurt somebody, we apologize. So if I step on somebody's toe, literally, my natural response that I don't have to think about is to say, oh no, I'm sorry, how can I help? Right? I would never say something like, I didn't know you were there. I'm not a toe stepper. One of my best friends has toes. That response wouldn't come to mind. Oh no, I'm sorry, how can I help? That's the response that comes to mind. That's pretty easy. And like I teach it to my 3-year-old. That's of course what you do in this situation. But maybe because we spend a lot of time trying not to notice our own privilege, we have trouble, I think, translating this thing that is obvious in all of these other contexts to a context where we experience privilege. Because it's basically someone pointing out a thing that is often unconscious and that feels uncomfortable. So if we have racial privilege, when we do or say something that has a racist impact, if somebody says that was racist, we're all of a sudden saying, in the realm of saying, I'm not a racist. Oh, I don't do that, right? As opposed to, oh no, I'm sorry. How can I help? All right, so what do we do about this second part of addressing racial privilege? Again, I'd like to give you just a few concrete action ideas to get started. And first, it can be helpful to just locate ourselves. So again, I'm going to invite you to pull out that pad of paper or that notebook that you have and just write down what identities you have, both privileged and oppressed, or at least the ones that come to mind most easily. So for example, what's your racial identity? What's your gender identity? Your sexual orientation? Your citizenship status? Are you disabled? Are you neurodivergent? Anything else that comes to mind? And I think this can be helpful because it just starts drawing our attention to dimensions where we might be more privileged, less privileged, or we might experience more discrimination. It helps us think about how those identities combine to shape our experiences in different contexts. A second thing to consider doing is to just learn more about patterns of experience for people in groups. And there are so many ways to work this into your daily life, right? There's reading nonfiction, reading novels, watching movies and TV. There's so many experiences to learn about and so many ways to learn about them. And often learning about other people from whom we are different helps us understand that our own experience isn't the only one. Gets more clarity about the ways that we have privilege and the ways that we might have disadvantage. A third idea is to just practice noticing your own privilege, how you benefit from the system, not just how other people are oppressed by it. And then a simple and straightforward one, but one that I find so helpful, is to just how to apologize ahead of time. Because I think so often some of the anxiety that especially white folks have around talking is really about this part. It's really about, oh no, but what if I mess up and say the wrong thing? And somebody says, that's racist. And if we can just realize that that's kind of like when you walk into a room and you accidentally step on somebody's toe and they say, ouch. And we don't like into rooms because, oh no, what if we step on somebody's toe? We walk into the room and if we step on something, we try not to toe step. But if we do, then we would say, oh no, I'm sorry, I have an ice pack. Is there anything else I can do to? And we could adopt a similar sort of approach in thinking about what we might do or do something racist. What a great opportunity to learn about that, and how will we respond? So Francesca Ramsey has a great video on how to apologize when you get called out that just walks you through this that I find very helpful. You could probably just Google getting called out, how to apologize, and find this video. And she just walks through, I mean, it's basically, oh no, I'm sorry, how can I help? But it's a little bit more advanced than that. And it's a really useful tool for just thinking this through ahead of time. All right, so hopefully today we've brought into better view some of the aspects of racism that are often harder to see for people with racial privilege. And in doing so, we are in this system, and so we have the power to change it, and we can take specific actions starting right now, today, to walk against the motion of the moving walkway, to move in an anti-racist direction. And just in closing, I'd like to thank the SCNA Racial Justice Committee for having me today. Thanks to Mary Ellen for hosting us. And I also want to acknowledge that a lot of what I talked about today came from listening to and learning from Cindy Pickett, Della Mosley, Paris Bellamy, and Kira Hudson. So if I said things today that are helpful, it is thanks to those four women. And thank you for listening. I'm going to turn things over to Bruce, or I don't know if that's turning over so much as working in tandem with Bruce,
Yes.
to take questions.
Yes. Thank you, Alison. I'm trying to put my question, I've got just a couple to start the discussion with. Let me just see if I can copy it and put it to everyone so everyone can see it. There we are. Because that was really striking, you know, the price of houses for a buyer, depending on whether it's a perceived black house or a white house, or entering a car. And I'm wondering if that bus education levels, income, even race and ethnicity, or is everybody subject to these biases?
A great question. Trying to think of research on income. I'm not sure I know what off the top of my head. There's some research suggesting that you can measure sort of directly the automatic associations that people have. It's not actually directly, but you can sort of get a sense of how easy it is for people to pair, for example, white people with positive traits and the idea of black people with negative traits compared to vice versa. And there's some research to suggest that many people, most people, have an automatic tendency to pair white with good stuff and black with bad stuff in the US, and that automatic tendency can, in some studies, persist across racial groups. So that research suggests that you know, racism is kind of in the air, or sometimes it's likened, Thea Salter, a social psychologist, a cultural psychologist, talks about racism as the water that the fish swim in. It's in the water, it's in our culture, it's hard to get out of it, it's going to influence us if we're swimming in this water. But I should mention that the extent of that bias is less and sometimes reversed for Black folks. So it's not the case that everyone is going around carrying exactly the same amounts of bias. And it's interesting to note that Black Americans are much more aware on average of the history of race and racism in the United States compared to white folks. And so that might be part of why you see those differences. Right?
We have a question from Ginger Rutland. What brought you into this discipline, and why is race?
I like that question. I mean, I got interested in originally because I am interested in how people think, and social psychology in particular because I was interested in how people from different groups can get along with each other better. So I was interested in sort of conflict and intergroup harmony. But my interest in racism in particular sharpened following the last presidential election, when I started, and I was pregnant at the time, and I just had this this sense of like, how can I bring a kid into this world that looks like this? And I think I saw for the first time something that had been there since the beginning of this country, that I started to see more than I had seen the sort of deep, pervasive racism in our country. And to me, the election clarified that I was part of that I hadn't been working as hard as I could to move against that, to move in the opposite direction of the moving walkway. And so I started to kind of learn more about it and try to get more active in this work at that point.
Okay, thank you. We have another question from Kathy Less. You've given examples of saying something inappropriate, catching yourself, then apologizing. What about when we're a third party and observe something that is inappropriate, offensive, whatever? Should we handle it? What's the best way to handle that?
This is a great question, and it's so hard. And I have like 6 thoughts at once, so let's see which ones come out and in what order. I mean, one thought I have is that I think white people especially, too often in those situations, prioritize white comfort over speaking up, or really prioritize white comfort over the well-being and safety of Black people and people of color. So I think we, meaning white people like me, need to speak up more than we do. And we need to get way less comfortable. And then there's the question of how to speak up. And I think that one is complex and important. I think, and I think my answer is different if you're the third party and you're and you're a member of a more advantaged group or a more disadvantaged group in a situation. So about racism, let's stick with racism because it makes the language more precise. But if you hear something racist and you're a Black person or a person of color, like I'm not, you get to respond how you get to respond. I have no advice or like constraints on that. You get to have your response. Like if somebody steps on my toe, I get to say ouch, however loudly and with however many swear words come out of my mouth in that moment. But if you are white in that situation and you hear something racist, the way I'm thinking about it these days is that I have more mental bandwidth to try to do 2 things at once. One is attend to the harm caused to a Black person or a person of color in the room or in the space at that moment. And it's actually 3 things at once. The second thing I think about is what to say for onlookers. So especially when you're in a larger group setting or in an online setting, there are bystanders, right? It's not just the person who said something, the person who maybe got hurt, and you. There's also other people watching. And I think a lot of education can happen for those other people in that moment. And then there is there an education opportunity, a chance to grow for the person who said the thing? And I try to navigate that. I mean, those are the considerations going on in my head. And so I think I try to being gentle in a way that provides a possibility for growth with being firm, or I don't know if these are the right words, but I think sort of the goal can be to create a little bit of discomfort. It shouldn't be comfortable. We don't get anywhere, we don't grow if we're comfortable. So it should be to create a little bit of discomfort. The goal should be to create a little bit of discomfort, but not so much that somebody just shuts down. And sometimes my goal stops being to persuade the other person. If I try that and it doesn't work, sometimes my priority shifts to, okay, there's other people, might they learn if I sort of restate the point and explain why it was harmful, and if it's online, like link to provide more information.
Okay, thank you. There are a couple recommendations on the chat. Everybody can see those on the chat from NBC News interviews and the Heart of America by Walter Johnson. So I would just point those out. We had a question from Mike McKeever, and he asks, are there any positive examples, for example, families, neighbors, cities, employers, or employees who have purposely addressed racial bias issues and made significant advances?
That's a great question. I think it's important to look for those examples and use them as guides, right? So where have people made changes that are having real effects? And I don't, wait, what were the, I can't see the, what were the specific?
Cities, and all those examples of, purposeful advances by addressing the racial bias issue.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm most aware right now of initiatives in universities because that's where much of my attention is these days. So I know of examples of, there's a neuroscience program at UC Davis, it's adjacent to psychology, that made really enormous, that made some real changes that produced really dramatic results in the both the diversity of that program and the inclusiveness of the environment, the felt inclusiveness of the environment in a relatively short period. But I think, it's useful to look for those examples in a specific area you're interested in and try to learn from them.
I'm interested in if you have, it's a kind of a corollary question. Do you have examples of efforts to lead individuals who are unconsciously biased and the biases are strong and they express those biases, rather more easily? I'm talking about sort of, hard nuts to crack, I guess you'd call it. And are there efforts and are they successful? And how do those efforts work?
Yeah, it's another great question. I think sometimes it's important to distinguish between unconscious bias and conscious bias. So I think sometimes are consciously biased. They're okay with being biased and they're saying these things out loud and they know. And that can just be important to keep track of in our own minds. And so I think I would take different tacks with somebody who seems to sort of endorse what they're saying versus somebody who says something and doesn't quite realize. If it's somebody who doesn't quite realize, then I might try again to sort of feel out the situation and think about like what could make them a little uncomfortable. So often just restating something that somebody has said.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the person said it but didn't really think about it, and just hearing it back or hearing it in slightly different words can give them pause, and then they're like, oh, that's not actually what I mean. So they say something and you say, okay, so you're saying that XYZ?
Mm-hmm.
You're saying that we should prioritize this thing that is pretty highly related to socioeconomic status over this other thing that's not, sometimes gets people to sort of reconsider. Mm-hmm. Or saying, I'm sorry, can you say more about why you would say that? That can be useful. A friend and colleague of mine once said, in the context of sexism, that she was deliberately trying to flinch more or deliberately trying to like let herself flinch when somebody says something sexist. And I found this so interesting because I like censor the flinches, right? And I think this goes back to the like prioritizing people's comfort thing. Somebody says something that's sexist, especially, and I school my expression and I don't react at all and I keep the smile on my face. And it's so different if somebody goes like this to you, you realize that you've said something that bothers them. So I think that can be a useful tool too. For somebody who is just biased, just plain old biased, I would go with a different tack. I would say something clearly about, and what that can do is it can have a big impact on social norms. So a lot of research in my field shows that our perception of what's okay to most people has a really big impact on our behavior, right? You don't turn around and face backwards in an elevator, not because that would be somehow immoral or illogical, just because everybody else is facing forwards in the elevator and it would feel really strange to do something different from what everybody else is doing. So when somebody tells a racist joke or makes a comment at a family dinner party or a Zoom group, I'm trying to think of like in our new world, what do? We don't sit around the table in a big party. And if you call them on it, if you say, that's racist, it makes clear, or that really be uncomfortable when people say things like that. It makes clear that it's not okay. And they may not change their own internal private beliefs, but it may make them less likely to say that aloud next time. And that is important just because saying it aloud shapes the social norms too.
One of the most dramatic changes in American attitudes was the last 15 years that ended. There was, I believe it's one of the fastest changes in the general population of any, what we call a prejudice, I guess. And I'm not trying to equate anti-gay prejudice with what we're talking about is racial prejudice. However, is there a clue in some ways about socializing with knowing people who are gay? I'm a gay man, but I'm also white and older, and has those qualities that that make me listener and discussant in these forums. But I'm wondering, is there something to be learned about bringing down some of the biases that we do have consciously by forming social networks that we're not doing? Because in the example of anti-gay bias, it seems that knowing a gay person is the single most important element to people losing their prejudice against gay people. And I'm wondering if there's a parallel here that we should discuss.
Yeah, that's a great point. And there is a lot of research on something called the contact hypothesis, which says exactly what you just summarized so beautifully, that when we know somebody personally from a different social group, whatever those different social groups might be, that is a really good predictor of what our attitudes towards that group will be. And forming those connections can change our attitudes in a positive direction. And so there are summer camps and other programs that seek to do this around race relations in the US and have for decades. But I think we could be thinking much more intentionally about and carefully about how to increase intergroup, interracial contact in a way that both, it's not like anything helps. So in-person contact is different than online contact. And there are a bunch of conditions that you have to have in place. So you need the people from different groups to have equal status. Like it can't be like one group is kind of in charge. And a number of other conditions. And I think it would be so important to do it in a way that is safe, that would not do harm to Black folks and people of color. So we would need to think through in the same way that you wouldn't say, well, like straight people really need to get over their biases. So like, let's have some gay folks go in and talk to them and that'll help. Like, you're not going to use one group as a tool for the other's education, right? So I think we would need to be, it's important to be really thoughtful about how that's done. But yes, when it's done well and carefully, it can be a positive experience for everybody.
Okay, are there other questions from the group that's here, or comments? Please feel free to put them on chat. Here's a comment from Greg Beal, who teaches a class for Renaissance Society on racism and prejudice. We cannot underestimate the devil we're fighting. So far, incorrectly, we've looked at how to change, how to become an anti-racist. But we are internalizing the guilt alone. We need to find a way to shame those racists, especially those who politically morphed into fascists, into looking at their behavior again. I propose that this demographic only understands one thing, and that is force. And even then, fascism so killed the brain that only death will stop them. Witness Nazi Germany in 1945. So what do we do then? When we're told that we're socialists, or a president calls out the Proud Boys on us, what do we talk about? Institutional racism at the top.
Yeah, I think, I don't know what to do about white nationalists that's focused on white nationalists. I know what to do that's focused on the rest of us, which there are far more, so many more of the rest of us. And that's to focus on organizing and coalition building and taking collective action and doing things that meaningfully shift policy and laws. And I think there's a lot we can do when we sort of put all of our collective effort into organized, intentional, careful action led by activists who have been doing this work for a really long time under a lot of adverse circumstances, and right, white nationalism isn't new, and so that's where my response to that question is, to kind of focus on what I have power over, what I have control over, which is reaching out to people, kind of like what we're doing right now, and organizing and coordinating with others.
We have a comment, I think, or maybe it's a question in the comment. I'll read it. I'm concerned that the conversation is reducing race to an individual action when decisions that impose the harshest racial antagonisms on minority residents. This does not appear to be unconscious, and it's really part of my vision as well. You know, it's that, as you say, conscious bias where people are hard nuts to crack. And it's an institution. It is institutionalized.
Yep, and this is such an important point that we have to keep in mind, that that definition of racism that we started with at the beginning, that it's this complex interplay between the system and institutions and laws and policies and individuals, and that we're not gonna get out of it by persuading. This is such an important point. We're not gonna get out of it by persuading one person at a time. That's important, but we also need to be devoting a lot of our time and effort to changing the system level things. Okay. But notice that they're connected, right? I would just say that connecting to other people is how we change the systems. We can't, right, one vote or one yard sign or one action that one person takes is probably not going to have. You have to be changing the systems in collaboration with other people.
Okay, several questions have just come in. This one's from Adeldi Reyes to everyone. Can you talk a little more about the implicit association test? The designers of the test state that there's no link between the findings of the test and actual discriminatory behavior. What do you think about its value then at the population level?
Yeah, so the implicit association test got really popular, in part just because it was widely available, and it's an online, it was put online, so it's an online test, and what are you going to do when you have a few minutes? Go take an online test. And so it's one of actually several measures that were developed by social psychologists to look at these automatic associations that I was talking about earlier. There's been a lot of controversy lately over both implicit bias and implicit bias training, based on the fact that your score on this test, which is a test that you take on the computer and you press buttons as fast as you can, does not necessarily predict your behavior in, for example, the job application study that I showed you earlier. Like, what are you going to do when you have a job application in your hands? Or do you call the police on a particular person? Part of that is because one single behavior isn't a good measure. So to study this, look at repeated behaviors over time, and people haven't really done that. But that's a little bit of an academic point. A different way to think about it is that by we I mean both researchers, but then also it's researchers' fault, but because of the way we talked about it, also people more broadly, got all caught up in equating implicit bias with this one particular test. And they're not the same thing. One is like your scores when you click some buttons on a computer, and one is the kind of broader idea. They do things, whether it's clicking buttons on a computer or choosing a job applicant or sitting down next to one person instead of another person on the bus, or looking out our window when somebody's walking by our car versus not. Sometimes our behavior is influenced by race in a way that we're not attending to. And so that idea has been very well documented. We can catch ourselves doing it probably. And it's been very well documented across a number of studies. And I think that's where we should sort of focus our attention rather than on one particular test.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from Jerry Bueller. The belief that neighborhoods lose value when people of color move in communities. Is it supported or refuted by studies? Is this just a belief that perpetuates itself? Has there been a change over time?
So it certainly was true, but not for a passive reason. If Dan is here, he should maybe jump in because gosh, I'm bad with dates. But the historian should be talking right now. But it certainly was true circa the area of blockbusting. But it was true because people were making it true. White people were making it true. So white real estate were deliberately going into neighborhoods when Black people moved in and telling the white neighbors, oh, a Black person moved into your neighborhood, home values are going to go down, better sell, and then get them all to sell and then buy the houses and turn a profit. So it's true in that sense because white people did that. I don't know if, I don't know the stats on this recently. Does anybody in the audience, you could put it into the chat? Or
yeah, I've privately asked Dan if he'd like to comment. Dan, are you there? Dan Murphy?
I am there. Hi. I don't have any concrete information other than that I would agree with your general view. If you recall, when we talked about this last week, the statement that the real estate agency put out when the proposition was passed to allow people to discriminate in the sale of houses very strongly took this view, that unavoidable consequence. And it's a self-fulfilling view. If that's your notion, that people may not have any of the classic indicators of racial bias on their own right, but we're also involved in the wealth of our houses, that if someone suggests there's a threat to that wealth, then we may well react negatively to that, even if we don't harbor really explicit racial bias. Over time, just as Bruce was talking about, the miraculous, chaotic change that occurred with regard to people's attitudes towards gay people has started to penetrate, I suspect, a strata of society. And this is certainly not as true as it was. You could look at Curtis Park. And Ginger has told us, that it was comfortable for her to come here because there was a number of multiracial people living in the neighborhood. So over time, this wears down. What no one can predict that I know of is when we get that same kind of flip between states, between when it's a generally accepted view or a largely accepted view, and when people say, that's baloney, that's old-fashioned thinking. It certainly isn't true in my experience. And that happens when they have a lot of contact with the other Black people, with other minority people of color. That's what overcomes that kind of attitude. I know in my own life, I can tell you that just generally, my perception was that in my parents' generation, they were very concerned about this. And I would say, particularly in our neighborhood now, but I think generally across the like-minded people, it's really not the same kind of concern that it was. That's hopeful, but it doesn't solve the problem. And because much of the problem is made up by the fact that the consequences of segregation, long-lasting consequences, have deprived people of color of the means to buy into the neighborhood. That momentum is something that you were talking about, Alison, about how to walk against that momentum and turn things around. And I don't have any more insight into that.
Thank you, Dan. There's a question from Mary Ellen Burns about family. How do we talk to our grandchildren, in her case, 5 who are biracial and 1 who's transgender, about how to respond when they are confronted by racism, conscious or unconscious?
That is such an important question, and I'm not the person to ask. And there are resources out there for this. So I would look into those. I mean, part of why I'm not the person to ask is because I didn't have white and I didn't have to deal with racism growing up, and I am responsible for teaching my white kid to not be racist. But I haven't had to think about how to teach him what to do if he experiences racism, right? We talk about standing up for people or standing with other people, but we don't have to talk about this. So this is a good example of a white person being ignorant about something because I don't have to deal with it.
There's another question. It's from Ann Cantner, which is a closely related question. I don't know how you'll feel about answering this one. What ideas do you have on how and when it's best to introduce concepts of unconscious bias and systemic racism to young people?
As early as possible. So there's research suggesting that, so a lot of Black folks and people of color have like the talk with kids at some age to kind of prepare them for encountering racism. And for the person who asked that question, I can look up the research on it and let you know what it says. I just don't know it off the top of my head. But for the question about like how to prepare your kid for experiencing racism, so there is research on it. But that wasn't the question that I was answering right now. The question I was answering right now is when to start talking to kids.
Yeah, how and when.
Yeah. So there's some great research on that just came out on white parents talking to their kids about racism, and this researcher, a social psychologist by the name of Sylvia Perry, who's at Northwestern, was interested because so many white parents don't talk to their kids about racism because they're like worried that it'll go wrong, or they don't want to spoil childhood innocence or something, and because white people in this country like are taught not to talk about racism, so the whole thing is fraught. And so a lot of times white parents just skip it over. Sylvia Perry was interested in what what happens if white parents do it, even if they don't think they did it very well? And so what her study shows is that just talking about it helps, even if the parent feels like, oh, that was kind of a mess, and I don't know if I said the right thing, and maybe I said the wrong thing. Just bringing it up is better than not bringing it up at all. And so you can try to, some common advice is to scaffold on kids' innate sense of fairness that develops fairly young. So maybe around 4 or 3. So he doesn't understand fairness yet. He still thinks that it's fine if he has all the cookies and I don't have any cookies. I'm working on that. I really want some of the cookies. But soon, I think he gets a sense of fairness. Really young kids have this sense, and you can scaffold on that to talk about a lot of concepts that are important for understanding racism. And they understand things like rules, right? So you don't say policy, you say the rules. And you can use words that are age appropriate, but these actually, like a lot of what we think is complicated about racism is not as complicated as we think, or can be like turned into age appropriate concepts. And then another thing that I think can be useful if you're talking to a kid from the perspective of kind of answering this, thinking about my white kid, so that's the sort of perspective I'm coming to from it, but to it from whatever, it's late. But another thing to kind of think about is what concepts you can introduce that will help for these conversations. So even if you think it's a little young, to sit down and have like a conversation about the history of slavery, you can still be scaffolding important concepts that a kid will need for when they get to that conversation. So, you know, again, with my 3-year-old, and even when he was younger than 3, we did a lot of reading books with very diverse characters, but also talking about skin tone. Kids understand skin tone. They notice skin tone very early. So parents who tell themselves that's not a thing, the kid sees race, and then they learn that adults don't talk about race if they're around a lot of white adults. And so then they don't talk to adults about it, but they talk to each other about it. So naming skin tone and talking about it as just a thing you can notice and talk about, and that's okay. And then we do things like what does it mean to listen? There's this book that I love called The Rabbit Listened, which I just feel like I learned so much from the book. I'm like reading it like, oh, right, listening, this is what it means to listen. And so things like that, talking about like, you know, we're gardening and we notice that the cilantro that we planted in the shade isn't doing as well as the cilantro that we planted in the sun. Or maybe it's vice versa, I'm not the best gardener. But we notice some sort of difference in how the plant is doing based on how much sun and shade it's getting. And we can talk about how, oh, it's interesting that depending on what you get, you do differently in this garden, right? Things like that. Also just put a plug in for the website Craze, which is hosted by, done by this amazing person, Asia Ray, who curates books for kids that are sort of deal with everything that you would want to talk to your kids about in this space and beyond. And so I lean on it very heavily for book recommendations, and they are always very good.
Okay, well, we've come to the end of the program. I want to thank Alison Ledgerwood for a wonderful hour and a half. It's a long time, Alison. You did so well. Thank you. And I want to also thank the rest of the Sierra Curtis Neighborhood Association's Ad Hoc Committee for Racial Justice, which includes Kathy Less, who's the chair, Dan Murphy, Ginger Rutland, Dennis Kusick, Nuri Nshizo, Mike McKeever, Mimi Budd, Katie Byram, and myself. I'm thanking myself. Mary Ellen DeBagian, who did our technical Zooms for these 2 webinars, and the Renaissance Society, but thank you very much for that assistance and the publicity of the 2 webinars. And finally, I want to thank the board of the Sierra Curtis Neighborhood Association and our executive director, Terry Shettle, who were so supportive of our efforts. And I think will continue to be very supportive of the Ad Hoc Committee on Racial Justice. So with that, I think we can close the evening. Thank you. And thank you all for coming and your comments and your thoughts.
Thank you.